Trace your finger along a map of Asia in your head right now until it hits one narrow gap in the mountains, tucked into the northwest corner of the Indian subcontinent. For 50,000 years, almost every wave of people who ever shaped the population of over 1 billion humans funneled through that single gap. And for more than 100 years, two rival stories about who came through it and what they did when they got there were treated as the only two possible answers. Both of them were about to be proven wrong at the same time. In 2015, a small team of scientists in India began quietly working through a stack of ancient bones pulled from Rakigarhi, a Bronze Age city in the modern state of Haryana that was once one of the largest urban settlements on the planet. They were not looking for treasure. They were looking for DNA, a molecule so fragile that heat, moisture, and thousands of years of bacteria usually destroy it, long before anyone gets the chance to read it. One by one, sample after sample failed. 60 separate burials gave up nothing usable. The genetic material inside them broken down years, sometimes decades, before anyone alive today ever opened a test tube. The team, led by archaeologist Vasant Shinde and geneticist Neeraj Rai, working alongside geneticist Vagish Narasimhan and a wider international group of collaborators, kept going anyway because one skeleton remained. It belonged to a woman buried in the city roughly 4,500 years ago, right at the height of the city's peak as an urban center. And it took over 100 failed extraction attempts on that single set of remains before a usable genetic profile finally came out of her bones. When it finally worked on what researchers later described as the 101st try, nobody in that lab could have known they were holding the piece of evidence that would quietly detonate 2 centuries of argument the moment it reached print. That moment came in September of 2019 when 2 papers built around this research landed at the exact same time in 2 of the most respected scientific journals in the world, Cell and Science. Publishing that way, together, on the same day, in 2 separate journals, is not something that happens by accident. It is usually a sign that a finding is considered big enough and contested enough that the people behind it want the full weight of the evidence to land all at once rather than trickling out one claim at a time. And the weight behind it really was enormous. The 2 papers didn't rest on the Rakigarhi genome by itself. They were built on top of the largest ancient DNA study ever attempted up to that point, pulling in genetic data from more than 500 previously unstudied ancient individuals scattered across South and Central Asia. A single coordinated release that expanded the entire world's collection of published ancient human genomes by roughly a quarter in one go. Dozens of geneticists, archaeologists, and anthropologists across multiple continents had spent years assembling that dataset, and all of it, in the end, hinged on whether that one fragile skeleton from Rakigarhi would ever give up a usable genome at all. For decades before that single success, the debate over where Indian civilization actually came from had been stuck between 2 competing answers, and neither one had real genetic evidence behind it. The first idea, invented by European scholars in the 1800s, claimed that outsiders called Aryans swept in from the northwest and single-handedly built Indian civilization, its languages, its religious texts, and its social order, almost from scratch, as though nothing of real consequence existed there before they arrived. The second idea, popular in more recent decades, flipped that story completely. It claimed nothing important ever came from outside at all, and that everything, including the so-called Aryans themselves, originated inside India and spread outward from there to shape civilizations elsewhere. Both stories carried, and still carry, enormous political weight, tangled up with religious identity, regional pride, and competing claims over who gets to be seen as the true architects of Indian civilization. Both of them turned out to be incomplete once real evidence entered the picture. To understand why, it helps to think about genetics, the way you'd think about a family recipe passed down for generations, one that gets slightly rewritten every time a new cook adds their own ingredient, but never fully replaces what came before. A population's DNA works the same way. Every group that mixes into a population leaves a trace that survives, diluted but detectable for thousands of years afterward, which means scientists can, in principle, read a population's genome the way you'd read the layered ingredient list of a very old family dish, working backward to figure out who added what and roughly when. That single Rakigarhi genome, once decoded, showed exactly 2 ingredients: ancient hunter-gatherer ancestry native to South Asia, mixed with ancestry connected to early farmers from the Iranian plateau. What it did not show was any trace of a 3rd ingredient: ancestry from the Eurasian steppe, the very ancestry that a later migration would eventually carry into the region. In other words, the woman from Rakigarhi lived and died before that migration ever happened, which meant her genome could act like a snapshot frozen in time, a before picture the debate had never had access to. Researchers checked her against 11 other ancient individuals from sites in Iran and Turkmenistan and found a close match, confirming she wasn't an outlier, but a representative of an entire population stretching across the edges of what's now called the greater Indus Valley world. This is the part where the popular version of the story, the one many people grew up hearing, starts to fall apart. The old invasion narrative pictured outsiders sweeping in and essentially replacing the population that built the great cities of the Indus Valley. If that had actually happened, scientists would expect to see almost no genetic continuity before and after the later migration that did eventually arrive from the steppe around 4,000 years ago. Instead, the ancient DNA record shows the opposite. The ancestry connected to the builders of those cities never disappears. It runs straight through that migration and shows up strongly in nearly every South Asian population studied since, North and South alike. The people who laid out the planned streets, built the advanced drainage systems, and ran the long-distance trade networks of the Indus Valley civilization were not erased. Their genetic signature is still here, carried today by well over 1 billion people. If you're the kind of person who likes finding out the version of history you were taught was only half the picture, this is exactly the kind of ancient story your own DNA might be quietly carrying, too. So stick with this one, because the next part is where it gets even stranger. To really understand where that deep hunter-gatherer ancestry came from in the first place, you have to zoom out far, past the Indus Valley cities, back roughly 50,000 years, to the same broad wave of migration that carried modern humans out of Africa and eventually across the entire globe. Geneticists call this founding South Asian population the ancient ancestral South Indians, and nearly every person alive in South Asia today traces some portion of their ancestry back to this single original wave, rather than to several separate early migrations, which, if they happened at all, left barely any detectable trace behind. These founding people did not stay confined to one river valley. Over tens of thousands of years, their descendants spread from the mountainous northwest all the way down to the southern tip of the peninsula, forming the deep foundational layer that every later population would eventually be built on top of. The clearest living window into what this founding population actually looked like comes from an unexpected place, the Andaman Islands, a remote chain in the Bay of Bengal. Some communities there stayed isolated from the mixing that reshaped the mainland for tens of thousands of years, which means their DNA still carries a concentrated dose of that original ancestry, almost like a time capsule that never got opened. In a very real sense, these communities are a living echo of what the whole subcontinent looked like before farming, before cities, and before any of the migrations that came afterward. Around 10,000 years ago, a second ingredient entered the recipe. Ancestry linked to early farmers from the Iranian plateau, moving through that same northwestern mountain gap and gradually mixing with the hunter-gatherers already living across the region. Researchers are still working out exactly how farming itself spread alongside this ancestry, whether it moved mostly through migrating people, through the spread of ideas and techniques, or through some mix of both happening in different places at once. That combination of old and new ancestry eventually produced the population responsible for building the Indus Valley civilization's great cities, places like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, home at their peak to tens of thousands of residents, among the largest urban populations found anywhere in the ancient world at that time. These cities were laid out with planned street grids centuries before anything similar existed in Rome, and their covered brick drainage systems were so advanced that nothing quite like them reappeared in the region for well over 1,000 years after the civilization eventually declined. Their traders reached as far as Mesopotamia, carrying beads, ivory, and textiles along routes that connected this subcontinent to some of the other great early civilizations of the ancient world, and all of this happened without any strong evidence of the kind of centralized kings or monumental royal architecture that usually gets remembered as the hallmark of ancient power. Then, around 4,000 years ago, right as that civilization was already sliding into a long decline that historians still don't fully understand, a very different population began arriving through that same gap in the mountains, herders from the grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, a region stretching between Eastern Europe and Central Asia. A closely related branch of that same steppe population had already been moving west into Europe around the same time, which is not a coincidence. It's the same broad dispersal event, reaching two entirely different continents almost simultaneously, one branch on horseback heading toward Europe, another moving southeast toward a subcontinent already home to millions of people. And this is where one of the strangest, most surprising facts in the whole story shows up. The languages carried by these steppe migrants eventually became the ancestors of both the languages spoken across most of Europe today and the languages spoken across most of northern India today, including Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, and Bengali. That means Hindi and English are not just distantly similar by some coincidence. They share identifiable ancient roots, both descended from branches of the same original language family that split apart on the Eurasian steppe roughly 4,000 years. Hago, one branch heading west into what would become Greek, Latin, and the Germanic and Slavic languages, the other heading southeast into what would become Sanskrit and eventually the modern languages, spoken by hundreds of millions across northern India. But the genetic evidence adds an important twist to that migration story, one that changes how you should picture it happening. When researchers looked closely at how the incoming steppe ancestry mixed with the population already living in the northwest, they found the mixing was heavily lopsided by sex. The genetic signal from the steppe shows up far more strongly on the male line, tracked through the Y chromosome, than on the female line, tracked through mitochondrial DNA, which is the genetic material passed down almost entirely through mothers. That pattern suggests the newcomers were disproportionately men integrating into existing communities over generations, rather than entire family groups arriving, all at once and displacing everyone who was already there. A particular male genetic marker connected to this migration, known as haplogroup R1a, still shows up today at higher rates in some communities than others across northern India, giving researchers an independent thread of evidence to trace how that migration's legacy carried forward through the male line specifically, long after the original migrants themselves were gone. This kind of male-biased mixing pattern is not unique to South Asia either. Geneticists have found similar signatures in other parts of the world where a migrating population settled among a much larger existing one, which is one more reason researchers trust the pattern here, rather than treating it as some strange local exception. It also carries real human weight beyond the abstract genetics. A pattern like this usually reflects generations of intermarriage, alliance building, and slow cultural blending between communities living side by side, rather than a single dramatic event, and it is exactly the kind of detail that a simple invasion story, with its image of armies and conquest, was never built to explain. The combination of Indus Valley-related ancestry and this new steppe ancestry produced what geneticists now call ancestral North Indian ancestry. Around the same time, related populations that had moved south and east during the Indus Valley's decline mixed more heavily, with communities carrying higher proportions of the older founding ancestry, producing a second lineage called ancestral South Indian ancestry. For centuries after that, these two broad populations kept mixing with each other across the subcontinent, gradually blending further with every generation. And then something highly unusual happened, something that, almost by accident, ended up handing modern scientists an almost unheard of level of detail about the deep past, sometime between roughly 2000 and 4,000 years ago, depending on the region. That long period of ongoing mixing largely stopped. Strict rules requiring people to marry only within their own defined community became widely enforced across large parts of South Asia, a practice that hardened over time into the caste system in its more rigid historical form. In purely genetic terms, this had an accidental side effect. It froze the existing mix of ancestries in place within thousands of separate communities, almost like sealing a snapshot in glass right at that moment in time, instead of letting the ancestry keep blending together indefinitely the way it had for thousands of years before. That's why researchers today can find measurable genetic differences between communities that have lived side by side in the very same town for centuries, differences that trace directly back to how strictly and for how long that separation was enforced and nothing else. It's important to be precise here because this is a place where the evidence is easy to misread if you're not careful. Researchers have found that, on average, the proportion of steppe-related ancestry in a given community correlates loosely with that community's traditional position in regional caste hierarchies. That correlation is real, and it shows up across independent studies conducted by different teams, but it is a historical pattern describing who married whom over thousands of years, not a ranking of people and not a measure of anything except which ancient populations a group's ancestors happen to descend from and mix with. Caste itself is a social and religious system shaped by an enormous number of historical, political, and cultural forces that genetics alone cannot explain, and it has been, and remains, a real source of documented social inequality that no genetic finding changes or excuses. What the genetic pattern actually offers, from a purely scientific angle, is something almost accidental, a natural experiment in which centuries of strict marriage rules turned into one of the most detailed living records of ancient population structure found anywhere on the planet, an archive preserved not in bone or soil, but in the marriage patterns of families still alive today. That archive has consequences that reach beyond history books too, because so many South Asian communities married within tight, defined groups for so long, certain rare genetic conditions and disease risks show up at noticeably different rates from one community to the next, information that doctors and public health researchers now use to better understand and screen for inherited conditions in specific populations. A direct, practical, present-day payoff from a pattern that started purely as a social and religious rule thousands of years ago. If you're the kind of person who wants to keep tracing where the pieces of your own story might actually come from, this is exactly the kind of thread this channel keeps pulling on. So stay with this one, because there's one more twist coming before the picture is complete. That layered history also explains why India looks so genetically different depending on where you happen to be standing. Researchers describe a gradient running roughly north to south across the subcontinent, with northern populations carrying somewhat higher proportions of steppe and Iranian farmer-related ancestry, and southern populations, especially many communities speaking Dravidian languages like Tamil and Telugu, carrying higher proportions of the older founding ancestry instead. Certain tribal populations in central and southern India carry the highest concentrations of that original founding ancestry, found anywhere on the mainland today, making them living windows into what the region looked like, before farming and long before the steppe migration ever reached it. The Northeast tells yet another story entirely, shaped by a separate and much older migration route connecting South Asia to Southeast Asia through the mountains near Myanmar. A reminder that the Northwestern Gap was never the only door into the subcontinent, just the busiest one. None of these genetic zones line up neatly with the borders on a modern political map because they formed gradually over tens of thousands of years, long before any of today's countries existed to draw a line through them. And once you put the full picture together, both of the old rival stories start to look less like opposing truths and more like two incomplete fragments of something much bigger. The invasion story ignored the deep, unbroken continuity of the original population, the same ancestry that built the Indus Valley cities and is still carried by people across the subcontinent today. The purely indigenous story ignored two real, well-documented migrations from outside, one bringing farming roughly 10,000 years ago, one bringing new ancestry, and a new language family roughly 4,000 years ago. Carrying that ancestry doesn't make anyone less authentically part of the region. Their family has called home for thousands of years, because both of those movements were ancient migrations, not recent invasions, and both happened so long ago that they are simply woven into the deep story of the place now, not separate from it. It's worth being honest about the limits of all this too, because that honesty is part of what makes the evidence trustworthy in the first place. Ancient DNA can trace where a population's ancestors came from, and roughly when different groups mixed. But it cannot measure culture, faith, or lived identity, and it absolutely cannot tell you anything about a person's intelligence, personality, or destiny. Ancestry is a record of movement across time, not a verdict on anyone descended from it, and the researchers involved in this work have been careful to say so directly and repeatedly. What the evidence does establish is a population history far older and stranger than either simple origin story ever allowed for, roughly 50,000 years of migration into a subcontinent that had, as far as anyone can tell, been empty of modern humans until that point, followed by farmers arriving through one narrow mountain gateway, followed much later by herders arriving through that same gateway, followed by thousands of years during which communities gradually separated and, without meaning to, preserved a record of everything that came before. Several real questions remain genuinely unresolved, including exactly how farming first spread into the Northwest, and exactly how and why marriage rules hardened into such a durable, widespread system across so much of the subcontinent. Those remain active areas of ongoing research, not settled facts, and any honest telling of this story has to say so. It's also worth stepping back and noticing that South Asia is not an isolated case. Over roughly the past 15 years, ancient DNA research has quietly rewritten the accepted origin story of one country after another, and whether that story was built on old colonial assumptions, more recent nationalist retellings, or generations of oral tradition, nobody had ever been able to test directly. Almost every time researchers gather enough ancient genomes and actually read them, the tidy, simple version, people grew up believing turns out to be missing pieces, sometimes small ones, sometimes whole chapters. South Asia's case stands out mainly for its scale, more than 1 billion. People whose ancestry traces back through at least 3 distinct deep layers, and for how directly its findings collided with 2 organized, politically active origin narratives that had each spent decades building institutional support behind them. But the underlying shape of the story, a simple assumed history giving way to a more complicated, documented one, has now played out on nearly every continent scientists have studied closely enough to test. The headline finding from Rakigarhi stands on its own regardless of that wider pattern. One skeleton, buried for nearly 5,000 years, nearly lost to soil, heat, and time, saved from 100 straight failed attempts only by 101st try nobody was fully expecting to work, was enough on its own to quietly dismantle 2 centuries of competing national origin stories at once. So picture that gap in the mountains one more time, the one nearly every ancestor of over 1 billion living people passed through at some point across 50,000 years, carrying farming, carrying language, carrying an ancestry no single myth on either side of the debate ever fully captured. If a story like that, hiding in your own ancestry or someone else's, is the kind of thing you want to keep uncovering, this channel exists for exactly that. So subscribe and stick around for what gets sequenced next.